Ranger Apprentice, Book 1, The Ruins of Gorlan, by John Flanagan. Chapter 24. Something happened, Halt said quietly, signaling for his two companions to rein in their horses. The three riders had cantered the last half-kilometer to the gathering ground. Now as they crested a slight rise, the open space among the trees lay just below them. 100 meters away, small one-man tents stretched in ordered ranks, and the smoke of cooking fires scented the air. An archery range had been set up on one side of the open space, and several dozen horses, all small and shaggy, ranger horses, were gazing close to the trees. Even from where they sat on their horses, they could make out an air of urgency and activity throughout the camp. In the center of the tent lines was a larger pavilion, easily 4 meters by 4 meters, and with enough headroom for a tall man to stand. The sides were currently rolled up, and Will could see a group of green and grey-clad men standing around a table, apparently deep in conversation. As they watched, one of the group detached himself, running to a horse waiting just outside the entrance. He mounted and spun the horse on its back legs, setting out through the camp at a gallop, heading for the narrow track through the trees at the far side. He had only barely disappeared into the deep shadows under the trees when another rider appeared from the opposite direction, galloping through the lines and reining in outside the large tent. His horse had barely stopped before he swung down and headed in to join the group inside. "What is it?" Will asked. Frowning, he realized that several of the small tents were being packed, struck and rolled up by their owners. "Not sure," Halt replied. He gestured to the tent lines. "See if you can find us a decent campsite. I'll see what's going on." He urged Abelard forward, then turned and called back. "Don't pitch the tents yet. From the looks of things, we may not be needing them." Then Abelard's hooves were drumming on the turf as he galloped towards the center of the camp. Will and Gilan found a campsite under a large tree, reasonably close to the central gathering area. Then, uncertain as to what they should do next, they sat on a log waiting for Halt's return. As a senior ranger in the corps, Halt had access to the larger pavilion, which Gilan explained was the command tent. The corps commandant, a ranger named Crowley, would meet with his staff there each day to organize activities to collate and evaluate the reports and information that individual rangers brought to the gathering. Most of the tents near the two younger rangers were unoccupied, but there was a thin, gangly ranger outside one, pacing impatiently back and forth, looking every bit as confused as Gilan and Will. Seeing them on the log, he moved over to join them. "Any news?" he said immediately, and his face fell when Gilan answered. "We were hoping to ask you the same question." He held out his hand in greeting. "It's Merron, isn't it?" he said, and they shook hands. "That's right, and you're Gilan, if I remember correctly." Gilan introduced Will, and the newcomer, who appeared to be in his early 30s, looked at him speculatively. "So you're Halt's new apprentice? We wondered what you'd be like. I was going to be one of your assessors, you know." "Going to be?" Gilan asked quickly, and Merron looked at him. "Yeah, I doubt we'll continue with the gathering now." He hesitated, then added, "You mean you haven't heard?" The two newcomers shook their head. "Morgrath is up to something again," he said quietly, and Will felt a shiver of fear up his spine at the mention of the evil name. "What happened?" Gilan asked, his eyes narrowing. Merron shook his head, stirring the dirt in front of him with the toe of his boot in a frustrated gesture. "There's no clear news so far, only garbled reports. But it looked as if a force of walkers broke out of the three-step pass some days ago. They overran the sentries there and headed north." "Was Morgrath with them?" Gilan asked. Will remained wide-eyed and silent. He couldn't bring himself to ask any questions, couldn't bring himself to actually mention Morgrath's name. Merron shrugged in reply. "We don't know. Don't think so at this stage. But Crowley has been sending scouts out for the past 2 days. Could be it's just a raid, but if it's more than that, it could mean the start of another war. If so, it's bad time to lose Lord Loriak." Gilan looked up, concern in his voice. "Loriak is dead?" he asked. And Merron nodded. "A stroke, apparently. Or his heart. He was found dead a few days ago, with not a mark on him, staring straight ahead, stone-cold dead." "But he was in his prime," Gilan said. "I saw him only a month ago, and he was healthy as a bull." Merron shrugged. He had no explanation, he only knew what the facts of the matter. I suppose it could happen to anyone, he said. You just never know. Who's Lord Loriak? Will asked Gilan quietly. The young ranger shook his head thoughtfully as he answered. Loriak of Steeden. He was the leader of the King's heavy cavalry, probably our best cavalry commander. As Merron said, if there's a war, he'll be sorely missed. A cold hand of fear closed around Will's heart. All his life, people had spoken in whispers of Morgorath. If they'd spoken of him at all, the great enemy had assumed the proportions, almost a myth, a legend from the dark old days. Now the myth was becoming reality once more. A confronting, terrifying reality. He looked at Gilan for reassurance, but the young ranger's handsome face showed nothing but doubt and concern for the future. It was almost an hour before Halt joined them. As it was after midday, Will and Gilan had prepared a meal of bread, cold meat, and dried fruit. The grey-haired ranger sat down from Abelard's saddle and accepted a plate from Will, eating the food in quick bites. The gathering's over, he said shortly between mouthfuls. Seeing the senior ranger's arrival, Merron had drifted back to join their group. He and Halt greeted each other briefly. Then Merron posed a question that was all on their minds. Is it war? He asked anxiously, and Halt shook his head. We don't know for certain. Latest reports show that Morgorath is still in the mountains. Then why did the Wargals break out? Will asked. Everyone knew that Wargals only did the will of Morgorath. They never would have performed such a radical act without his directions. Halt's face was grim as he answered. They're only a small party, perhaps 50 of them. They were intended to act as a division. While our guards were busy chasing the Wargals, Crowley thinks that the true Kalkara slipped out of the mountains and are holed up somewhere in the solitary plain. Gilan gave a low whistle. Merron took a step back in surprise. Both the younger rangers' faces showed their utter horror at the news. Will had no idea what the Kalkara might be, but judging from Halt's expression and the reactions of Gilan and Merron, they were obviously not good news. You mean they still exist? Merron said. I thought they died out years ago. Oh, they exist all right. There are only 2 of them left, but that's enough to worry about. There was a long silence between them. Finally, hesitantly, Will had to ask, What are they? Halt shook his head sadly. It was not a subject that he wanted to discuss with someone as young as Will, but knowing what lay ahead of them, all he had no choice. The boy had to know. When Morgorath was planning his rebellion, he wanted more than an ordinary army. He knew that if he could terrify his enemies, his task would be far easier. So over the years he made several expeditions into the mountains of Rain and Night, searching. Searching for what? Will asked, although he had the uncomfortable feeling that he knew what the answer would be. For allies he could use against the kingdom. The mountains are ancient, undisturbed part of the world. They've remained unchanged for centuries. There were rumors that strange beasts and ancient monsters still lived there. Those rumors turned out to be all too true. Like the Wargals? Will put in, and Halt nodded. Yes, like the Wargals. And he very quickly enslaved them and bent them to his will, he said with a touch of bitterness in his voice. But then he found the Kalkara, and they're worse than the Wargals. Much, much worse. Will said nothing. The thought of beasts that were worse than Wargals were a disturbing one to say the least. There were 3 of them, but one was killed about 8 years ago, so we know little more about them. Think of a creature somewhere between an ape and a bear that walks upright, and you'll have an idea what a Kalkara looks like. So does Morgorath control them with his mind like the Wargals? Will asked. Halt shook his head. No, they're more intelligent than Wargals. They're totally obsessed with silver. They worship it and hoard it, and Morgorath apparently gives it to them in large amounts. So they'll do his bidding, and they do it well. They can be incredibly cunning when they stalk their prey. Prey? Will asked. What sort of prey? Halt and Gilan exchanged a glance, and Will could see that his mentor was reluctant to talk about the subject. For a moment he thought Halt was going to begin another of his dissertations on Will's endless questions. But then he realized that this was far more serious matter than idle curiosity, as the grizzled ranger replied quietly. The Kalkara are assassins. Once they've been given a specific victims, they will do anything in their power to reach that person and kill them. Can't we stop them? Will asked, his gaze shifting briefly to Halt's massive longbow and the bristling quiver of black arrows. They are very difficult to kill. They have a thick hair covering their matted and bonded together so that it's almost like scales. An arrow will hardly penetrate. A battle axe or broadsword is best against them. A good thrust with a heavy spear might do the job. Will felt a moment of relief. Those Kalkara had started to sound almost invincible, but there were plenty of accomplished knights in the kingdom who would doubtless be able to account for them. So was it a knight who killed one 8 years ago? He asked. Halt shook his head. Not a knight. 3. It took 3 fully armed knights to kill it, and only one of them survived the battle. What's more, he was crippled for life. Halt finished grimly. 3 men? All of them knights? Will said incredulously. But how? Gilan interrupted before he could finish. The problem is, if you get close enough to use a sword or a spear, the Kalkara can usually stop you before you have a chance. As he spoke, his finger drummed lightly on the hilt of his sword that he wore at his waist. How does it stop you? Will asked, the momentary feeling of relief instantly dispelled by Gilan's words. The next time it was Merron who answered. Its eyes, the gangly ranger said. If you look into its eyes, you're frozen helpless, the way a snake freezes a bird with its gaze before it kills it. Will looked from one to the other of the 3 men, uncomprehending. What Merron was saying seemed too far-fetched to be true, yet Halt wasn't contradicting him. Freezes you? How can it do that? We're talking about magic here? Halt shrugged. Merron looked away uncomfortably. None of them liked discussing this subject. Some people call it magic, Halt finally said. I think it's more likely a form of hypnotism. Either way, Merron is right. If a Kalkara can make you look into its eyes, you become paralyzed by sheer terror, unable to do anything to save yourself. Will glanced around anxiously, as if expecting any moment to see an ape-bear creature charging out from the silent trees. He could feel panic growing in his chest. Somehow he'd come to think of Halt as invincible, yet here he was, seeming to admit that there was no defense against those vile monsters. Isn't there anything you can do? He asked in a hopeless voice. Halt shrugged. Legend has it that they are particularly vulnerable to fire. Problem is, as before, getting close enough to do any damage. Carrying a naked flame makes it a little difficult to stalk a Kalkara. They tend to hunt at night, and they can see you coming. Will found it difficult to believe what he was hearing. Halt seemed so matter-of-fact about it all, and Gilan and Merron were obviously disturbed by his news. There was an awkward silence, which Gilan broke by asking, What makes Crowley think that Morgoth is using them? Halt hesitated. He'd been told Crowley's thoughts in private council. Then he shrugged. They'd all need to know about it sooner or later, and they were all members of the Ranger Corps, even Will. He's already used them twice in this past year, to kill Lord Northolt and Lord Loriac. The 3 younger men all exchanged puzzled glances, so he went on. Northolt was thought to be killed by a bear, remember? Will nodded slowly. He remembered now. On his first day as Halt's apprentice, the Ranger had received news of the Supreme Commander's death. I thought at the time that Northolt was too skilled of a hunter to be killed that way. Crowley evidently agrees. But what about Loriac? Everyone said it was a stroke. It was Merron who asked this question. Halt glanced at him briefly, then answered. You heard that, had you? Well, his physician was more surprised. Said he'd never seen a healthier man. On the other hand... He paused, and Gillis finished the thought. It could have been the work of the Kalkara. Halt nodded. Exactly. We don't know the full effect of the freezing stare they developed. Maintained over long enough time, the terror could be well enough to stop a man's heart. And there were vague reports that a large dark animal was seen in the area. Again silence settled over the small group under the trees. Around them rangers bustled to and fro, striking camp and saddling their horses. Will finally roused them all from their thoughts. We'd best get moving, Merron. You'll need to return to your fief. Crowley wants the army alerted and mobilized. Orders will be distributed in a few minutes. Merron nodded and turned away towards his campsite. He paused, turned back. Something in Halt's voice, the way he had said, "You'll need to return to your fief," had made him think. "What about you 3?" he said. "Where are you going?" Even before Halt answered, Will knew where he was going to say. But that didn't make it any less terrifying or blood-chilling when the words were said. "We're going after the Kalkara." Chapter 25. The camp buzzed with activity as tents came down. and rangers repacked their equipment and tied on their saddlebags. Already the first few riders had departed, heading back to their own fiefs. Will was fastening the tires on their saddlebags, having replaced the few items they'd taken out. Halt sat a few meters away, frowning thoughtfully as he studied a map of the area surrounding the solitary plain. The plain itself was a vast, unmapped area, with no roads and few features indicated. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up. Gilan stood there, a worry on his face. "Halt?" he said in a low, concerning voice. Are you sure about this?" Halt met his gaze steadily. "Very sure, Gilan. It simply has to be done." "But he's only a boy," Gilan protested, looking quickly to where Will was trying a pack roll back in the place-bound took saddle. Halt let go a long breath, his eyes dropping from Gilan's as he spoke. "I know that, but he's a ranger. Apprentice or not, he's a member of the corps, like all of us." He saw that Gilan was about to protest, further out of concern for Will, and he felt a sort of affection for his old apprentice. "Gilan, in an ideal world, I wouldn't put him at risk like this. But this is an ideal world. Everyone's going to have to play his part in the campaign, even boys like Will. Morgrave is preparing for something big. Crowley's agents have got wind of that. On top of everything, he's been in touch with the Scandians." "The Scandians? What for?" Halt shrugged. "We don't know the details, but my bet is he's hoping to form an alliance with them. They'll fight for anyone for money. And apparently they'll fight for anyone as well." He added, his distaste for mercenaries obvious in his voice. "The point is, we're short-handed enough while Crowley tries to raise the army. Normally I wouldn't go after the Kalkara with a force of less than 5 senior rangers, but he simply can't spare them for me, so I have to settle for the 2 I trust most, you and Will." Gilan grinned crookedly. "Well, thanks for that anyway." He was touched by Halt's confidence. He still looked up to his old mentor. Most of the Ranger Corps did. "Besides, I thought that rusty old sword of yours might come in handy if we run into those horrors," Halt said. The Ranger Corps have chosen wisely when they allowed Gilan to continue his training with the weapon. Although very few people knew it, Gilan was one of the finest swordsmen in Ireland. As for Will, don't sell him short. He's very resourceful, he's quick and brave, and a damn good shot already. Best of all, he thinks quickly. My real thinking is that if we get on the trail of the Kalkara, we can send him for reinforcements. That'll help us and keep him out of harm's way." Gilan scratched his thin chin thoughtfully. Now that Halt had explained it, it seemed the only logical course for them to take. He met the older man's eyes and nodded his understanding of the situation. Then he turned to organize his own kit, only to find that Will had already repacked it and tied it to his saddle. He smiled at Halt. "You're right," he said. "He does think for himself." The 3 of them rode out a little while later, while the other rangers were still receiving their orders. Mobilizing the Ireland army would be no small task, and it would be the rangers' job to coordinate it, then be ready to guide the individual forces from the 50 fief to assembly point at the plains of Uthal. With both Gilan and Halt assigned to searching for the Kalkara, other rangers had to be tasked with coordinating the forces from their fiefs as well. There was little said between the 3 companions as Halt led the way to the southeast. Even Will's natural curiosity was subdued by the magnitude of the task ahead of them. As they rode in silence, his mind's eye kept conjuring images of savage, bear-like creatures with the features of apes. Creatures that might well prove to be invincible, even for someone of Halt's skill. Eventually, however, as monotony set in, the horrific images receded, and he began to wonder what plan, if any, Halt had in mind. "Halt?" he said a little breathlessly. "Where do you hope to find the Kalkara?" Halt looked at the serious young face beside him. They were traveling at the ranger's forced march pace, 40 minutes in the saddle, riding at a steady canter, and 20 minutes on foot, leading their horses and allowing them to travel unburdened, while the men ran at a steady trot. Every 4 hours, they would pause for 1 hour's rest, when they ate a quick meal of dried meat, hard bread, and fruit, then rolled into their cloaks to sleep. They'd been leading the horses for some time now, and Halt judged that it was time to rest. He led Abelard off to the road and into the shelter of a grove of trees. Will and Gilan followed, dropping the reins and allowing their horses to graze. "The best way I can think of," he said in answer to Will's question, "is to start at their lair and to see if they're in the vicinity." "Do we know where that is?" Gilan asked. Best intelligence we have is that it's somewhere in the solitary plain beyond the stone flutes. We'll scout around that area and see what we can find. If they're in the area, we should find that the old sheep or goat is going missing from the villages nearby. Although getting the villagers themselves to talk will be another matter. Plains people are the close-mouthed bunch of the best at times. What's this plain you're talking about? Will ask, through a mouthful of hard bread. And what on earth is a stone flute? The solitary plain is a vast, flat area, very few trees, mainly covered in rock, outcrops and long grass, Halt told him. The wind seems to always be blowing, no matter what time of year you go there. It's a dismal, depressing place, and the stone flutes are the most dismal part of it. But what are? Will began, but Halt only paused briefly. Stone flutes? Nobody really knows. They're a circle of standing stones built by the ancients, smack in the middle of the windiest part of the plain. Nobody has ever worked out their original purpose, but they are arranged in such a way that the wind is deflected around the circle and through a series of holes in the stones themselves. They create a constant keening sound, although why anyone thought they sound like flutes is beyond me. The sound is eerie and discordant, and you can hear it from a kilometer away. After a few minutes, it sets your teeth on edge, and it goes on for hours. Will was silent. The thought of a dismal, windswept plain and stones that emitted a non-stop keening wail seemed to take the last vestige of warmth from the late afternoon sun. He shivered involuntarily. Halt saw the movement and leaned forward to clap him on the shoulder encouragingly. Cheer up. Nothing ever as bad as it sounds. Now let's get some rest. They reached the outskirts of the solitary plain by noon the second day. Halt was right, Will thought. It was a vast, depressing place. The featureless ground stretched out before them for kilometer after kilometer after kilometer, covered in tall, grey grass, made rank and dry by the constant wind. The wind itself almost seemed to be a living presence. It rubbed on their nerves, blowing constantly and unvaryingly from the west, bending the tall grass before it as it swept across the flat ground of the solitary plain. Now you can see why they call it the solitary plain, Halt said to the two of them, reining Appalad in so they could go abreast of him. When you ride out into this damned wind, you feel as if you are the only person left alive on earth. It was true, Will thought. He felt small and insignificant against the emptiness of the plain, and with the feeling of insignificance came an accompanying feeling of impotence. The wasteland they were riding across seemed to hint at the presence of arcane forces far greater than his own capabilities. Even Gilan, normally cheerful and brilliant, seemed affected by the heavy, depressing atmosphere of the place. Only Halt seemed unchanged, remaining grim and taciturn as ever. Gradually, as they rode, Will became aware of disquieting sensation. Something was lurking just outside the range of his conscious perception. Something that made him feel uneasy. He couldn't isolate it, couldn't even tell where it was coming from, or what form it took. It was just there, ever present. He shifted in his saddle, standing in the stirrups to scan the featureless horizon in the hopes that he might just see the source of it all. Halt noticed the movement. You noticed them, he said. It's the stones. And now that Halt said it, Will realized that it had been a sound, so faint and so continuous that he couldn't isolate it as such, that had been creating the sense of unease in his mind, and the tight cramping of fear in the pit of his stomach. Or perhaps it was just that as Halt said it, they came into proper earshot of the stone flute, because now he could isolate it. It was an unmelodic series of musical notes, all being played at once, but creating a harsh, discordant sound that jangled the nerves and unsettled the mind. His left hand crept unobtrusively to the hilt of his axe knife as he rode, and he drew comfort from the solid, dependable touch of the weapon. They rode on through the afternoon, never seeming to advance across the empty, featureless plain. With each pace their horses took, the horizon behind and before them seemed to neither recede nor draw closer. It was as if they were making time on an empty world. The constant keening sound of the stone flutes was with them all day, growing gradually stronger as they traveled. It was the only sign that they were making progress. The hours passed, and the sound continued, and Will found it no easier to bear. It wore at his nerves, keeping him constantly on edge. as the sun began to sink at the western rim. Halt reined Abelard in. "We'll rest for the night," he announced. "It's almost impossible to maintain a constant course in the dark, without any significant land features to set a course by. We could easily wind up going around in circles." Gratefully the others dismounted. Fit as they were, the hours spent at forced march pace had left them bone weary. Will began scouting around the fused on the bushes that grew on the plain, searching for firewood. Halt, realizing what was in his mind, shook his head. "No fire. We'd be visible for miles, and we have no idea who might be watching." Will paused, letting the small bundle he had gathered fall to the ground. "You mean the Kalkara?" he said. Halt shrugged. "The more plains people. We can't be sure that some of them aren't in league with the Kalkara. After all, living cheek by jowl with creatures like that, you might well end up cooperating with them just to ensure your own safety. And we don't want them getting word that there are strangers in the plain." Gilan was unsaddling Blaze, his bay horse. He dropped the saddle to the ground and rubbed the horse down with a handful of the ever-present dry grass. "You don't think we've been seen already?" he asked. Halt considered the question for a few seconds before answering. "We might have been. There are just too many unknowns here, like where the Kalkara actually have their lair, whether or not the plains people are their allies, whether or not any of them have seen us and reported our presence. But until I know we have been seen, I'll assume we haven't, so no fire." Gilan nodded reluctantly. "You're right, of course," he said. "It's just, I'd happily kill someone for a cup of coffee." "Light a fire to brew it," Halt told him, "and you might end up having to do just that." Chapter 26. It was a cold, cheerless camp. Tired from the hard pace they had been keeping up, the Rangers ate a cold meal. Bread, dried fruit, and cold meat once more. Washed down with cold water from their canteens. Will was beginning to hate the sight of the virtually tasteless hard rations they carried. Then Halt took the first watch as Will and Gilan rolled themselves into their cloaks and slept. It wasn't the first rough camp that Will had endured since his training period began, but this was the first time there wasn't the slight comfort of a crackling fire, or at least a bed of warm coals to sleep by. He slept fitfully uncomfortable dreams chasing through his subconscious. Dreams of fearful creatures, strange and terrifying things that stayed just outside his consciousness, but close enough to the surface that he felt their presence and was unsettled by them. He was almost glad when Halt shook him gently to wake him for his watch. The wind was shooting clouds across the moon. The moaning song of the stones was stronger than ever. Will felt a weariness of spirit and wondered if the stones had been designed to wear people down like this. The long grass around them hissed, a counterpoint to the far-off keening. Halt pointed to a spot in the heavens, indicating an angle of elevation for Will to remember. "When the moon reaches that angle," he told the apprentice, "turn over the watch to Gilan." Will nodded, rousing himself and standing to stretch his stiff muscles. He picked up his bow and quiver and walked to the bush Halt had selected as a vantage point. Rangers on watch never stayed in the open by the campsite, but always moved away 10 or 20 meters and found a place of concealment. That way strangers coming upon the campsite would be less likely to see them, was one of the many skills Will had learned in his months of training. He took 2 arrows from the quiver and held them between the fingers of his bow hand. He would hold them thus for the 4 hours of his watch. If he needed them, there would be no excessive movement as he took an arrow from his quiver, movement that might alert an attacker. Then he flipped the cowl of his cloak over his head, so he would merge with the irregular shape of the bush. His head and eyes scanned from side to side as Halt had taught him, changing focus constantly from close to the campsite and out to the dim horizon around them. That way his vision would not become fixated on one distance and one area, and he'd stand a better chance of seeing movement. From time to time he turned slowly through a complete circle, scanning the entire ground around them, moving slowly to keep his own movement as imperceptible as possible. The keening of the stones and the hissing of wind through the grass formed a constant background. He began to hear other noises as well, the rustling of small animals in the grass and other less explicable sounds. With each one his heart raced a little faster, wondering if this might be the Kalkara creeping in on the sleeping figures of his friends. Once, he was convinced that he could hear the breath of a heavy animal. Fear rose up in him, clutching at his throat, until he realized, with his senses tuned to the utmost degree, he could actually hear his companions breathing quietly in their sleep. He knew that from any more than 5 meters away, he would be virtually invisible to the human eye, thanks to the cloak, the shadows, and the shape of the bush around him. But he wondered if the Kalkara depended on sight alone. Perhaps they had other senses that would tell them that there were an enemy concealed in the bush. Perhaps even now they were moving closer, concealed by the long shifting grass, ready to strike. His nerves, already stretched beyond endurance by the stone flute's dismal song, urged him to spin around and identify the source of each new sound as he heard it. But he knew that to do so would be to reveal himself. He forced himself to move slowly, turning carefully until he faced the direction from which he thought the sound had come, assessing each new risk before discarding it. In the long hours of tense watching, he saw nothing but the racing clouds, the fleeting moon, and the undulating sea of grass that surrounded them. By the time the moon reached the preordained elevation, he was physically and mentally drained. He woke Gilan to take over the watch, then rolled back into his cloak again. This time, there were no dreams. Exhausted, he stepped soundly onto the grey light of dawn. They saw the stone flutes by mid-morning, a grey and surprisingly small circle of granite monolith that stood at the top of the rise of the plain. Their elected course took the raiders a kilometer or so to one side of the stones, and Will was content to go no closer. The depressing song was now louder than ever, ebbing and flowing on the tide of the wind. "Next flute player I meet," said Gilan with grim humor, "I'm going to split his lip from him." They rode on, the kilometers passing beneath their horses' hooves, hour after hour, one the same as the next, with nothing new to see, and always with the faint howl of the stones at their back, keeping their nerves on edge. The plainsman rose suddenly from the grass some 50 meters away from them, small, dressed in grey rags, and with long hair hanging unkempt to his shoulders. He glared at them through mad eyes for several seconds. Will's heart had barely recovered from the shock of a sudden appearance when he was off, bent double and running through the grass, seeming to sink into it. Within seconds he had disappeared, swallowed by the grass. Halt was about to urge Abelard in pursuit, but he stopped. The arrow he had selected instantly and laid on the bowstring remained undrawn. Gilan was also ready to shoot, his reactions every bit as sharp as Halt's. He too held his shot, looking curiously at his senior. Halt shrugged. "May need nothing. Or maybe he's off to tell the Kalkara, but we can hardly kill him on suspicion." Gilan let out a short bark of laughter, more to release the tension he felt as a result of the man's unexpected appearance. "I suppose there's no difference," he said, "whether we find the Kalkara or they found us." Halt's eyes fixed on him for a moment, without any sign of answering the humor. "Believe me, Gilan," he said, "there's a big difference." They had abandoned the forced march pace now, and walked their horses slowly through the tall grass. Behind them the sound of the stones began to fade a little, much to Will's relief. Now he realized the wind was carrying it away from them. Some time passed following the sudden appearance of the plain dweller, with no further sign of life. The question has begun nagging at Will all through the afternoon. "Halt?" he said experimentally, not sure if Halt would order him to silence. The ranger looked at him, eyebrows raised in a sign that he was prepared to answer questions. So Will continued, "Why do you think Morgoth has enlisted the Kalkara? What does he stand to gain?" Halt realized that Gilan was waiting for his answer as well. He marshaled his thoughts before he replied. He was a little reluctant to verbalize his thoughts, as much as of the answer depending on guesswork and intuition. "Who knows why Morgoth ever does anything," he answered slowly. "I can't give you a definite answer. All I can tell you is what I assume, and what Crowley thinks as well." He glanced quickly at his two companions. It was obvious from their expectant expressions that they were prepared to accept his assumptions as ironclad facts. Sometimes, he thought wryly, a reputation for being right all the time could be a heavy burden. "There's a war coming," he went on. "That much is already obvious. The Wargals are on the move, and we heard that Morgoth has been in contact with Ragnar. He saw the puzzled expression flit across Will's face. Gilan, he knew, understood who Ragnar was. Ragnar is the Oberjarl, or Supreme Lord, if you like, of the Scandians, the Sea Wolves. He saw the quick flash of comprehension and went on. This is obviously going to be a bigger war than we fought before, and we're going to need all our resources, and our best commanders to lead us. I think that's what Morgoth has in mind. He's seeking to weaken us by having the Kalkara kill our leaders. Nordhold, the Supreme Army Commander, and Loriak, our best cavalry commander, have gone already. Certainly there will be other men who will step into these positions, but there will inevitably be some confusion in the changeover period, some loss of cohesion. I think that's what's behind Morgoth's plan. Gilan said thoughtfully, "There's another aspect as well. Both those men were instrumental in his defeat last time. He's destroying our command structure and getting revenge at the same time." Halt nodded. "That's true, of course, and to a twisted mind like Morgoth, revenge is a powerful motive." "Do you think there'll be more killings?" Will asked, and Halt met his gaze steadily. "I think there'll be more attempts. Morgoth has sent them out twice with targets, and they've succeeded. I don't see any reasons why they won't go after others. Morgoth has reason to hate a lot of people in the kingdom. The king himself, perhaps. Or maybe Baron Errol. He caused Morgoth some grief in the last war." "And so did you," Will thought, with a sudden flash of fear for his teacher. He was about to voice the thought that Halt might be a target, then realized that Halt was probably well aware of the fact himself. Gilan was asking the older Ranger another question. "One thing I don't understand. Why do the Kalkara keep returning to their hideout? Why not just move from one victim to the next?" "I suppose that's one of the few advantages we do have," Halt told them. "They're savage and merciless, more intelligent than Wargals. They're not human. They're totally single-minded. Show them a victim, and they'll hunt him down and kill him, or die themselves in the attempt. But they can only keep track of one victim at a time. Between killings they'll return to their lair. Then Morgoth, or one of his underlings, will prime them for their next victim, then they'll head out again. Our best hope is to intercept them on the way if they've been given a new target, or kill them in their lair if they haven't." Will looked for the thousandth time at the featureless grass plain that lay before them. Somewhere out there, two fearsome creatures were waiting, perhaps with a new victim already in mind. Halt's voice interrupted his train of thought. "Sun's going down. We may as well camp here." They swung down stiffly from their saddles, easing the girths to make their horses more comfortable. "That's one thing about this blasted place," Gilan said, looking around them. "One spot is as good as another to camp, or as bad." Will woke from a dreamless sleep to the touch of Halt's hand on his shoulder. He tossed back the cloak, glanced at the scudding moon overhead, and frowned. He couldn't have been asleep for more than an hour. He started to say so, but Halt stopped him, placing a finger to his lips for silence. Will looked around and realized Gilan was already awake, standing above him. His head turned to the northeast, back the way they'd come, listening. Will came to his feet, moving carefully to avoid making any undue noises. His hands had automatically gone to his weapons, but he relaxed as he realized there was no immediate threat. The other two were listening intently. Then Halt raised a hand and pointed to the north. "There it is again," he said softly. Then Will heard it, above the moaning of the stone flutes and soughing of the wind through the grass. The blood froze in his veins. It was a high-pitched, bestial howl that ululated and climbed in pitch, an inhuman sound carried to them on the wind from the throat of a monster. Second later, another howl answered the first, slightly deeper in pitch. It seemed to come from positions a little to the left of the first. Without needing to be told, Will knew what the sounds meant. "It's the Kalkara," Halt said grimly. "They have a new target, and they're hunting."